Before children can actually learn to count in any meaningful kind of way, they need to know the number word list, which is the list of numbers in order, and they need to be able to know this by rote. That's the purpose of this presentation, to explore the background, the standards, and some strategies. An examination of several pivotal documents for early mathematics learning illustrates some very important reasons for children to learn how to rote count prior to counting actual objects. Those reasons are tied to other kindergarten standards. Here you see the Focus in Kindergarten document expresses the need for learning the rote count in order to reduce the cognitive load when they are required to employ one-to-one correspondence to count actual objects. There's actually a lot for a child to put together in a very coordinated way in order to accurately count. Having an accurate and fluent number word list is essential. Likewise, the progressions document, which is written by the Common Core writing team as an extension and elaboration of the Common Core math, expresses the same idea that children need to become fluent in the rote counting sequence, also called the number word list, in order to be able to put their focus and attention on pairing or matching each item with one number word. This is essentially getting at the same idea of reducing the cognitive load for the child, because when they count actual objects, there is significant coordination required. We will be addressing this idea of pairing in just a moment. The authors of the Common Core have stated that one of the documents that heavily influenced their work with early elementary standards was a document called Mathematics Learning in Early Childhood. It's available in our course resource library along with other Common Core web links. Here we see an additional reason for learning the rote count. It is listed as essential as a prerequisite for counting on and more advanced methods that students will employ as they engage with addition and subtraction. As such, we see an example of coherence, the emphasis that the Common Core authors have made on how mathematical ideas and strategies flow over time and across grade levels. The learning of the number word list and its use in rote counting can thus be seen as foundational in learning how to count in kindergarten, and then of course simultaneously foundational in the entire developmental sequence that will eventually lead to solution strategies for addition and subtraction. Although counting seems like an extremely basic task to adults, it requires tremendous amount of coordination for a child. Imagine a child counting 5 plastic bears. They have to coordinate a physical pointing motion, pointing at one object at a time and naming one number word. The number word list must be in exactly the correct sequence, and they must name only the one counting word for that object before they then point to the next object and mentally process what the next word is in the sequence. 2 things can make this counting sequence much more straightforward. One is if the child is already fluent in the count sequence of numbers to 5, and preferably beyond, and then also if the bears are already in a row so that the organization of the objects is not required. Then the child can focus more just on the one-to-one correspondence that's required. If the child is not fluent in the rote count, then so much mental energy is involved in thinking of the next number word that it is less likely that they will be able to focus on the important act of one-to-one correspondence. It is important to realize that learning the rote count does not mean that a child is developing any meaningful sense of what it means to count. Just because a child can count to 100 does not mean that he can reliably count out a given number of objects. The rote count is what Piaget called social conventional knowledge. It is what we humans who speak English have decided to use as labels for quantities, sequenced in such a way that we are adding 1 to the quantity each new word that we say. Counting, on the other hand, requires a child to develop mathematical relationships in their mind, so that's a completely different kind of cognition. Therefore, rote counting is not really what you might think of as real counting. Nevertheless, children can learn some important concepts, and these ideas can also be fostered through dialogue with other children. The big idea that you really want them to come to during the rote counting stage is the stable order principle. This is the idea that numbers form a list with a fixed order. That order is important, and the numbers must be stated in this sequence. Eventually, you want them to be able to have this list fluently available so that they can apply one number word to one object and automatically use the next word in the order as they point to the next item. Initially, children should hear and say the number word list often. Children who have heard the number list to 10 often in their preschool years typically come to school already having that portion of the number word list mastered. Next, you want to foster actions in conjunction with the number word list. The idea here is to prepare them for one-to-one correspondence. You can march and count where each foot stomp is timed with each number word. They can tap something or use pointing motions as well. You want the students to do so much rote counting that every idea you can possibly think of for how to put actions to the count have been kind of utilized at some point or another. When students seem to be fairly fluent, you can even try something like the Macarena, which often requires a bit more concentration, and therefore it gives you an opportunity to see whether their fluency level is holding solid or whether it falls apart when they get more complex movements. Throughout these experiences, you want to be aware of what the comfort zone is with the students. The number list that you use in choral responses with the learners should go just beyond that comfort zone. So they're getting experience over and over with the portion of the number word list that comes next. Now the idea here is that if they're counting to 100, but they're really only comfortable with the top 10, then most of the rote count is kind of lost on them. So the majority of counting should be just beyond what the class is feeling comfortable with occasional opportunities to extend it beyond that. Kindergarten children need to count every day, many times a day. Think about your schedule and when would be a good time to count. I do also want to point out one caution. I've mentioned in this slide that we need to look for opportunities for children to put actions to the number word list so that will help prepare them for one-to-one correspondence. Make sure, though, that as they put actions to them, that they are still putting one action to one number word, even when the number word has 2 syllables. So the first number that you get to that will create a problem that you should be looking for is 7. All the number words prior to that are 1 syllable. When they get to 7, they shouldn't use 2 actions. It should only be 1 action for the word of 7. And I mention this so that you can have some advance notice and think about that when you get to the number 7. If you have any time that is not actively being used for learning, consider adding in counting at that point. And this includes things like if children are standing in line waiting for dismissal, they might as well count in place and use their little foot stomps or little mini claps or something like that. If you have them wait outside the bathroom while classmates take turns going in, that's kind of dead time, so you might want to see how high can you count while your classmates are in the bathroom. You might want to march in the hall and find out how many foot stomps you had between your room and the playground as you go out to recess. Now, obviously, you might want to teach them how to whisper count before you go off in the hall and consider other classes. Parents very possibly do not realize how much extensive practice is needed for the rote counting sequence to reach a fluency level, and they may not understand why knowing the sequence fluently is so essential. Many adults think of counting as so basic that it should just come naturally. So if you're able to help parents understand how important it is that they get extensive practice in counting, just about everything that can be thought of, and have that support at home, that will really be desirable, particularly for children who arrive at school not having a rote count sequence already fluent to 25. Look for counting errors. As children begin counting, they move from random number words where they try to imitate the act of counting to actually using a counting sequence. This is very typical of preschool children, but kindergarten teachers need to be looking out for these issues. I remember that my youngest child skipped 13 and said 14 twice when she was in preschool. She was absolutely consistent. It came out that way all the time. She would go 10, 11, 12, 14, 14, 15, and it was quite a regular pattern. It would be wise early in the kindergarten year to have various counting centers, and therefore you could station yourself near one of the centers so that you can hear the children count and record any unique error patterns that they are making. As you listen to the learners count, then, consider the following questions. What portion of the number word list is stable for this child? Very consistently, they have that part in place. In the example that I gave of my daughter as a preschooler, I could record that her count sequence from 1 to 12 was stable. She skipped 13 and repeated 14 twice, and then she proceeded to count to 23, where everything fell apart after that. She would name all kinds of numbers starting with 20, but totally out of order, and many numbers repeated several times. It sounded a little like this: 21, 22, 23, 29, 24, 29, 27, 26. As you do this assessment, keep in mind whether the child was doing this as a rote count or if they were actually using hand motions or trying to count objects. Since counting real objects requires more coordination, it's normal to expect the rote count to be higher when they're just doing it rote than when they're doing it with counting actual objects. Having this assessment information recorded is very useful in terms of supporting individual learners and also as a benchmark to monitor growth over the course of the year. In your whole class instruction, it's reasonable to assume that your targeted rote counting sequence will extend beyond many learners' individual number word list. For example, you may be focusing as a class on the rote count to 20, even though a number of your learners are still working on a stable list to 10. In this case, the choral responses of the whole group still give the individual child an opportunity to hear an accurate number word list many, many times. However, in your individual support of learners, you really need to be more targeted to their point of need. This is where your anecdotal records on the kinds of errors that individual children are making is very useful. As you work with an individual learner or pairs of learners that are having similar struggles, focus just on the particular portion of the number word list that is problematic and do not focus on too many numbers at a time. Note the example here, which actually comes out of the Focus in Kindergarten book. In this example, the child's number list of 5 is stable, so the target number is 6. Notice that the work with the child stops at 6, and this helps the child focus on that next target number. Additional issues arise when children are learning to recognize written numbers and learning to write them. At the kindergarten level, they will learn to write 11 to 19, and this is a good time to reinforce the idea of 110 and some leftovers, which shows up in the kindergarten number and base 10 standard. One way to do this reinforcement is to help the students think of the number as having 2 names. This idea actually comes from some well-known math educators who are quoted here. An example that's shown here is with 12. In other languages, such as in China, the number word for 12 actually means 10 and 2. In this case, 12 gives the students no clues about its 10 structure. So Fuson and other researchers have talked about the possibility of helping students understand all the teen numbers as having a second name. So we can call this number 12, but we could also say it's 110 to 1s. This can actually help students consider how the way we write the number means something. It isn't just random. Some other difficulties that can occur have to do with auditory similarities between the word 13 and 30, or 14 and 40, and so on. So we need to be aware of that as well. The Common Core authors have emphasized that teachers at each grade level need to be cognizant of the skills that will be foundational at subsequent grade levels, and they need to be aware of how that knowledge is going to be extended. In first grade, children will need to develop meaningful understanding of the numbers 20 to 99. For example, they will need to understand them in terms of place value and in terms of how they are related to other nearby, maybe landmark numbers. They will need to understand them well enough to count out that many objects, counting by ones, twos, fives, tens. In first and second grade, children's understanding will be extended so that they can also operate on these numbers. In order to do these things, the children must first have fluency of the rote counting list, and that's a kindergarten expectation. So this connects to the idea that we've already addressed, that fluency with the rote counting list precedes actual meaningful use of the terms in counting situations. So in kindergarten, really focus on, by the end of the year, they should be able to do that count to 100 by rote, their meaningful understanding of numbers up through 20, and then their fluency, and this is getting a little ahead of ourselves, but their fluency will be up through 5. While you can reasonably expect children to develop the rote counting sequence to 100 at different rates, that's just pretty normal whenever you try to teach children anything, still, structured counting experiences can support them and reduce the learning time. If children understand the decade pattern of our number system, this can be particularly useful to them. You can include a chart similar to the one shown and then point at each number as you say it. You can have conversations around things that students notice about the patterns. Likewise, children often use a verbal pattern when they count, where they hold on to the 9 for a moment longer before transitioning to the next decade. I'm sure this will sound familiar to you. It sounds similar to 7, 8, 9, 10. Or this is even more common in the upper decades, where it's 28, 27, 28, 29, 30. So that is a part of a pattern as they enter the stage where they're nearing the end of the decade. And that also gives them a moment to kind of process in their mind what decade comes next. The children might actually have strategy shares or dialogues about how they keep track of which decade comes next. That's pretty hard. When you're saying 29, what kinds of things are going on in your head that help you know that the next number is going to be 30? You may have some students share that they actually think about skip counting by tens and what comes after the 20s. But get kids to kind of share some of their strategies for figuring out which decade comes next. In this presentation, you've come to see how important the rote counting sequence is and how foundational it is to the counting of actual objects in kindergarten, as well as to developing strategic counting skills for early addition and subtraction.